Welcome to Remarkable Retail Podcast, Season 8, Episode 15, presented by Salonis. I'm Michael LeBlanc. We have a fantastic episode for you featuring the virtual launch event for Steve's brand new book, Leaders Leap, recorded Monday, April 22nd. Steve is joined by a panel of extraordinary guests, all of whom are leaders in their respective fields. We have the privilege of hosting best-selling author and friend Seth Godin, an entrepreneur and speaker who has not only launched one of the most popular blogs in the world, but has also written 21 best-selling books. We also have Bridget Brennan, acknowledged as the leading authority on the world's most powerful consumer market, women. She is the author of the books Why She Buys, the new strategy for reaching the world's most powerful consumers, and Winning Her Business, how to transform the consumer experience for the world's most powerful consumers, and is the founder and CEO of the Female Factor consulting firm. Sally Elliott, the co-leader of Spencer Stuart's global retail practice based in London, and Hal Lawton, president and CEO at Tractor Supply Company, also join us. We'll be back next week with our regularly scheduled programming, including top retail news and an exclusive interview with the one and only Billy May, CEO of Brooklinen, live from the Bamboozer podcast studio, Shop Talk in Las Vegas. Let's listen in now as I kick off this fun and exciting episode. All right, it is 12:01, so let's kick it off. As I said, we got lots of great guests, so we'll be talking about the book and the principles of the book. We've got special guests, Seth Godin, Bridget Brennan, who are joining us live. We did a pre-interview with Sally Elliott from Spencer Stuart, and we've got a note from Hal Lawton from Tractor Supply, and then we'll get to audience questions. Steve, let's kick it in. Like, what was the impetus for writing this, your second book?
Well, it's been in the works for a long time. One of the things that I think is a bit of PTSD for me is,
there we go.
Some folks will know that I started my career at Sears, my retail career at Sears in 1991. And at that point, Sears had already dropped from being the biggest retailer on the planet. And as I'm sure many folks would know, Sears went through many, many years of decline and essentially doesn't operate anymore. So one question that's been gnawing at me for quite a long time is, how is it that some of these incredibly powerful, iconic brands end up going from the pinnacle of success to either irrelevance, limping along, or in some cases, complete extinction? And then, of course, as I've been out on my own as a consultant for 15 or so years, studying who's been successful, who's really disrupted various parts of the industry, who's really struggled or even gone away, I kept coming back to this question, if the world has changed so much, why have so many companies or so many leaders changed so little? And in my first book, I touched on that a little bit, but I really wanted to go deeper to try to understand, why is it that so many transformations fail to reach their objectives? McKinsey indicates that about 70% of transformations fail. And some other research shows that lots of CEOs, lots of management teams are really struggling to figure out what to do as the pace of change accelerates. And so I wanted to get into that, and I wanted to write a book that wasn't just kind of an academic strategy book, but was something that actually gets into more concepts of courageous leadership. What is it that leaders need to do, right? Not just kind of talk vaguely about culture or kind of academic strategic principles.
Who should read your book, Steve? Who did you intend the audience to be?
It's really written, I would say, mostly from the perspective of the C-suite, people that can really affect strategy. I do think people further down in the organization will benefit from it. It's probably worth mentioning that it is not a retail-specific book. It really is appropriate for just about any industry that's going through a lot of disruption, nonprofit, for-profit, big and small. But I think anybody that is struggling to navigate through the choppy waters of disruption, or perhaps has been at it for a while and aren't getting the kind of results they would hope for.
Well, you start the book, and there was the slide, and I'll put it back up, talking about this transformation gap. Can you take us through that?
Yeah, just very quickly. In the introduction, I talk about this, and it was something that I started to visualize. So just to kind of boil this down, on one axis, I thought about, what is the pace of disruption, this idea of the speed of disruption, which is in the subtitle. Now, that will vary by different industries. There's definitely some industries that aren't changing that quickly, but I think most of us are experiencing quite a lot of change, and in some cases, change that is more exponential than linear. So that's the one axis. On the other axis is the degree of differentiation that you need to really set yourself apart to be remarkable in the marketplace and be able to win and keep customers over the long term. Now, if you think about, if you go to the next slide, lots of what management time is spent on is optimizing their current business model. And so one way to visualize that is just, relatively minor changes over an extended period of time. Now, some companies are engaged in more aggressive efforts. You might call that sustaining transformation. So it's basically things that are a little bit more elaborate, delivering a little bit more value. So above this optimization path, but not incredibly quickly nor incredibly disruptive in terms of what you're delivering to the marketplace. But then if you think about what's happening in places or in markets where we've seen companies come in, whether it's what Airbnb and Vrbo have done to the lodging industry, or Uber and Lyft have done to the taxi industry, where you have this incredible leap in the degree of differentiation that's provided. And it happens comparatively quickly. Again, it may happen at different paces for different industries. But what I'm worried about, and I think what I try to really tee up in the beginning of the book, is if you're not aiming higher with the sort of results you deliver, and you aren't moving quickly enough and acting more boldly, this transformation gap may be created. And one of the things I think we've seen, particularly over the last decade, is once that gap is created, it often becomes harder and harder to catch up, and in fact may become next to impossible. So kind of the underlying premise of the book at the beginning, before I get into my prescription, which is if we're going to win the future, we're going to transform, we have to aim higher in the value we deliver. And in many cases, we have to move much, much faster. So this idea of kind of moving up into the right, leaping to the future is I really what I set up as the problem. And then, of course, the balance of the book is to give some ideas, some inspiration, some prescription about what to do about it.
Well, let's welcome our first guest, Seth Godin. Seth, throw that camera on. Let's see you. And Seth, first of all, happy Earth Day. You have a fantastic book of your many, many books. I only feature a couple of them here. Your latest, and of course, the Carbon Almanac and the classic Purple Cow. Welcome. Thank you for joining us.
Well, it's great to talk to anyone in Toronto, particularly a friend like you, Michael. Good to see you. Good to see you, Steve.
Well, thanks for joining us. Well, many people will know that I have leaned heavily on Seth over the years in some of my work, and Seth was nice enough to write a blurb. But we only have a few minutes with you, and one of the things I thought it would be fun to talk about, because I know you've talked about it for years, is this idea of taking a leap. Before I let you comment on that, Michael, could you throw up? There's a quote that I have loved for a long time. I actually include it in the book, and is this idea of whether there's a timid trapeze artist, they either get fired or they get killed. But ultimately, this idea of finding that right path and being willing to let go, to move to that next thing. Could you just describe a little bit how this idea of leaping has been part of your work for a while, and the way you think about it, and maybe some advice you would give to people about how to take those leaps?
This book is some of your least Harvard writing. And I'm saying that in the most positive way, because the mindset for a lot of people who think about strategy is TLDR, show me the 3 steps. What's the right answer? But as you and I have both been on stages over the last 30 or 40 years, telling people the right answer, they almost never do it, right? That I set up in front of the Newspaper Publishers of America in 1999 and explained to them exactly what was going to happen. And they're all like, yeah, but I'll be gone by then. And we can go down a long list of industries where the train was clearly coming. The shift is obvious. Telling people the strategy doesn't work. And what your book does is it spends at least half, maybe more, not talking about here are the 3 steps of figuring out the right thing to leap to, but instead it gets at the humanity of why you're busy bargaining as opposed to leaping. And it's that commitment that is not built in to the industrial complexes that we are all part of. because they are built on optimization.
Right.
And what you have done is taken lessons from all sorts of places that aren't the C-suite at Sears and helped people understand that your job is not to do your job. We have people who work for you to do that, and we have AI to do that. Your job is to figure out what your job is and to do it without a guarantee. The reason it's worth a book and the reason that people should consider your book is not because they should buy a copy and find the right answer, but because they should buy 10. Because buying 10 copies of the book gives you the surplus to hand 9 of them out. And if you are surrounded by 9 people who also get the joke, you will have discovered exactly why Silicon Valley works. It doesn't work because of Moore's Law. It works because you're surrounded by people who get the joke. And that's what books are great at. So I've already ranted for too long. This is the winner, and I'm really glad you wrote it.
Well, thank you. I appreciate that. I'm curious from your perspective because so much of what you talked about is how you get people to stop defending the status quo, take more risk, put their art out into the world. And I know you use art in a very particular way. As you've been doing this sort of work for years, are there any kind of hot tips about how to break through the resistance, how to take those chances? Because it's easy to say, right? But yet so many people don't do it.
Yeah, the part about take more risk is fascinating. You started by talking about the fact that Sears was unable to transform, and many companies are going to have similar challenges. Actually, every company is going to fail. Start with Wanamaker and go forward. Every company is either going to be purchased or fail. You just don't want it to happen on your watch. The opportunity is not to always figure out the correct thing to transform. It's to understand that there are a few people, I am one of them, who are wired or were raised to be hooked on that trapeze feeling. And I just keep switching from one project to another because I need that. But most people just want to do a good job. What it is to do a good job is to get comfortable with this idea that you can leap. The professor was this brilliant scientific genius, and he knew how to, build a nuclear reactor on Gilligan's Island, but he couldn't figure out how to make the radio work. No. And the thing is, you got to make the radio work, or you're going to be stuck on the island. You know everything you need to know. You've just got to decide, I'm going to make the radio work.
I love that. Well, plenty of people are stuck on the island. We're going to try to help them get off. I'm still trying to figure out why they had all that clothing for a 3-hour tour, but that's another topic for a different day. Anyway, thanks, Seth. Appreciate you taking the time to come on. Appreciate all the support, and hope people will check out your work if they haven't already. And we'll see you soon. Thanks.
Thanks, guys. Go make a ruckus, everybody.
Want to ramp up speed and productivity for your entire retail operation? In the Celonis Process Mining for Dummies Handbook, we show you how Celonis process mining technology, enhanced with process intelligent AI, can help you streamline performance across your entire retail business so you can drive lasting value from end to end. That means purchasing, supply chain, omni-channel execution, merchandising, and customer service processes, all managed and optimized through one powerful software solution. To get your free copy of Process Mining for Dummies and see how it's generated millions in value for brands around the world like Aldi, Globus, and Edeka, head to celonis.com/remarkable retail. Steve, the core of the book are what you call mind leaps. Take us through why these are important.
Probably the first thing I should say before I get into it is, out of these mind leaps, there are a set of things that I would call more strategic, and we'll give you a little flash insight into some of them in a second. But some of them are very strategic principles. But the thing is, I wrote this book, and it kind of follows on what Seth was saying. It's not a matter of giving people the answer. Here's the right strategy to follow. So if you're looking for kind of a blue ocean strategy book or kind of a heavy-handed academic book, you're probably going to be disappointed. Because I wanted to also get at these leadership principles, how we as leaders get in our own way or contribute to our organizations getting in the wrong way. So there's a little bit of a mix of both. But what I try to think about is, well, here's a state today that we find ourselves in. personally, and I talk a little bit about some of my challenges over the years in doing the things that needed to be done in my life and in my career. And then here's a different place to be. So leaping from one set of ways of managing, leading, being in the world to a fundamentally different way of thinking about it. So it's very much a mental choice, I believe. So that's the mind part. And then the leap is going from, this kind of mindset to hopefully a quite different mindset. So that's the concepts of it. There's 7 of them. So maybe I'll just quickly talk about or give people a flavor for each of them.
There we go.
And I think people will see some aspects. So there's a chapter on each of these. In the time we have, I'm not going to try to explain each one, but hopefully this will give people a flavor for what I get into. So the first one is what I call crushing your ego, becoming more humble, embracing vulnerability, being willing to ask for help, letting go of the things that probably got us here to get to really new places. The second, and I'm deliberately provocative here, is this idea of waking up. What I see a lot of times is quite a bit of denial on the part of leadership teams, or kind of sleepwalking through the revolution. If you think about what's happened in most industries over the last 20 years or so, it's usually quite profound. As I said, this is not a retail book, but it's probably pretty easy for most people, whether they're in retail or not, to think about the department store industry, which has lost market share for 20 straight years, while various other formats have grown tremendously. So, what does it take to dig deep to understand what's going on with competition, technology, customers, accept new emerging realities, break through that denial, and take action? In a lot of cases, that causes us to let go of things that brought us success in the past, kind of open the aperture, get into kind of beginner's mind, if people are familiar with that. These next 2 are a little bit more strategic principles, which is, I believe that the era of massification, kind of bigger is better, peak of the bell curve kind of strategies is largely over. That game has been won by a few players in most industries. So for most of us, success going forward is likely to be figuring out how to narrow your aim, discover this passionate core of customers that will really become your best customers, maybe editing or simplifying what you do to really amplify what's special. Number 4, the start with wow. So once you've narrowed your aim, how do you aim higher? How do you become truly remarkable? Create that emotional connection, create that story that is going to spread, that people are going to help tell the story of your brand. So think about this in terms of high net promoter score, to be very prosaic about it. Number 5 is really, and this is the boldness part of it, fortune favors the bold. I think I begin this chapter with, is to think more radically, to think about things that at once seemed impossible as possibly being the key to your future, really reimagining the future in a pretty fundamental way, and maybe reconfiguring your business in a pretty substantial way to be successful going forward. Number 6, which I think we'll come back to and talk about a little bit more in a second, is this idea that safe is risky. So maybe I'll just skip over that in the interest of time. And the 7th is really this idea of needing to go faster, to fail fast, be agile, innovate at what I call the speed of disruption, which again may vary for your industry, but generally speaking, I think if we look at how Gen AI came out of nowhere, it seems, and how many technologies have really changed the playing field for so many companies, so many industries, being built for speed is going to be important for I would say, the vast majority of companies.
Well, let's move to our next very special guest, Bridget Brennan. Bridget, join us on the camera. Welcome. Thank you so much for being here, and a couple of your amazing books that should be in everybody's library. Welcome.
So great to be here. Congratulations, Steve, on your launch day. This is so exciting. Love the book.
Well, I appreciate it, and I'm glad you were able to join us. You were also nice enough to write an endorsement for the book, which I definitely appreciate. One of the reasons that we wanted to have you on, a couple of these mind leaps really speak to getting more understanding of the customer, which seems like at one level a pretty obvious thing. But I know from my own work, I see it all the time where companies do not have a very good understanding of the customer, where maybe what was a good idea for many, many years it doesn't make sense anymore because the customers changed or shopping journeys have changed or whatever. Now, I know a lot of your work is focused on the female shopper, on women, but I'd just be curious as we think about, whether it's this idea of being special, not big, or amplifying the wow. Any insights there in terms of what you're seeing and what works for some of your clients and some of the folks you speak to?
Oh, Steve, I had so many thoughts going through my mind as I read your book. And here's what struck me, and here's why everyone is going to love your book. Everybody on this call, everybody who's going to read it. There are some books that you buy, business books, and you read them and you put them back on your shelf and you never think about them again. Leader's Leap is the kind of book that you're going to want to keep at arm's length on your desk to refer to all the time, getting quick hits of inspiration, reminders, grounding. I was lucky enough to get an early advanced copy of the book, and I have kept it on my desk. And it is a prized possession now in my business library. I just love that you give us the questions that we should be asking ourselves. And that's why for every reader is going to make this book their own, because we're all looking at the questions that you pose to us and then thinking about how they relate to our work and our lives and our careers. So congratulations on this great book. And as I was reading it, one of the mind leaps really struck me, and that was mind leap number 2, which is wake up, face new realities. And one of the things that it made me think about is the fact that when I talk to so many people about the topic of transformation, which is at the heart of your book, so many people, our minds go right to technology, right to AI. And actually, as you just mentioned, there are so many transformations happening with our customers. And one of the transformations that's happening right before our eyes is women's rising economic power, which is completely reshaping culture and the economy. So I think one of the big mind leaps that I took away from it is understanding the reality that being relevant in the consumer marketplace today means being relevant to women, which isn't always easy because about 90% of Fortune 500 CEOs are not women. So that's a mind leap for some people. I'll still get told, people will say to me, "Oh, you study women? What a great niche." But women aren't a niche. Yeah. And sometimes it takes a mind leap to recognize that.
Yeah, well, it is funny, again, that some of these things seem at one level pretty obvious, but a lot of times people don't do them. What have you found in your work helps leaders maybe undo the biases they have? Because one of the things I love about your book is just, and I believe it's the first one where you talk about that, marketing to females tended to be just make it pink, right? That just, as long as it's pink, right, you're really exactly catering to a female customer, which right, sounds just absurd. But nevertheless, that counts for strategy, I guess, at some companies. But how have you gotten people to really understand how to do that, to get closer to the customer and really, really understand what they need?
It's a great question, Steve. And I always say pink is not a strategy. And I think one of the biggest mind leaps that I've seen with companies who are successfully able to do this is to recognize that this topic is not a women's issue or a women's empowerment issue, but a strategic business opportunity that is amongst the roles and responsibility of everybody in the business, regardless of gender, and that it is a business issue and not simply a women's issue. Recognizing that is the first step, in my experience, with businesses that are successful.
Well, it's often said the first step to change is admitting you have a problem, and there's a lot of companies that have some problems to work on. Sadly, we're not going to be able to solve all those in just the few minutes we have with you. But thanks so much for joining us. I would encourage people.
Thank you,
actually been
and congratulations.
Been on the Remarkable Retail podcast, and her books are great. So I hope you will check those out. But thanks for joining us today.
Thanks, and congratulations.
Fantastic. Well, let's roll on now. You. Steve, you skipped over leap number 6, I think it was, which was that core idea. It's really a core principle of the idea that safe is risky. Take us through your thinking on that for a few minutes.
Yeah, I touch on this concept at the beginning of the book because, as it's turned out, again, at one level, I think perhaps we all know this, but, if you look at companies, whether we're talking about BlackBerry or Nokia, that have gone from the perches of greatness to essentially non-entities. Kodak, you can go down the list. Plenty of retail companies, obviously, Borders, Radio Shack, et cetera. Mostly, and Seth touched on this, they were either trying to optimize a business model that was running out of gas, or they were just inherently afraid to compete against themselves or to do some of those things that might have kept them from the brink of irrelevance. And I think fundamentally, we have to change our relationship to risk. We have to understand better the risk of inaction or the risk of a timid transformation, as I talk about it in one of the chapters. And we're not wired. I mean, this is one of the things I think I really appreciate from Stephen Pressfield's work, which some folks on the webinar might know. Stephen Pressfield talks about this concept of resistance, this force that keeps us from doing the things we know to do. That could be starting an exercise regime or writing that book or taking up guitar, whatever. But of course, it's very pernicious when it comes to business strategy. And, we see so many companies that watch and watch and watch as the world around them is changing massively. So developing a new relationship to risk, to understand that incremental change, or even in some cases, some fairly aggressive moves may turn out to be the most risky strategy of all. So I unpack that in the chapter, try to give some advice on how to think about it. I did write an HBR article a couple of weeks ago on this topic. If people want to check that out. I guess the other thing I would say, just going back to one of the things that Bridget mentioned that I forgot to mention earlier, is with each of these 7 mind leaps, one of the things I do at the end of the chapter is pose some questions because it's too hard to give advice, specific advice that's going to work for every single company, every single situation, every sector, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah.
But as Seth said, hopefully this gives the inspiration and the perspective and some of the key questions that are going to allow people to understand what some of their blind spots may be, what some of their opportunities may be that will propel them forward, and let them take those leaps big and small. Because one of the things about leaps is they're not all just like big business moonshot kind of leaps. They are a series of things we can do for ourselves with our team day in and day out.
All right, let's move on now to our next guest. Our guest is Sally Elliott. Steve, you and I met Sally last year at the World Retail Congress, and she was a guest on our podcast. And I believe you saw her again just recently in London. Right. She was interviewing Judith McKenna, I think, formerly leader of Walmart. So Sally Elliott, what a great leader. Talk about someone who knows leadership, co-leader, global retail practice at Spencer Stuart. So we have her video, pre-recorded video. The time thing wasn't going to work out so well. Well, Sally, thanks for joining us. Thanks for being here today. It's great to see you again. Before I turn it over to Steve, could you give us an overview, share with the audience a little bit about yourself and the work you do?
Yeah, of course. Well, first of all, thank you to you both for inviting me back, and very pleased to be speaking with you. I'm a consultant at Spencer Stuart, and I specialize in the retail sector, and I co-lead our global retail practice. And what we do is work with boards of major companies around the world, and we support the decisions that they make about their leadership. So who they should appoint into key roles, particularly the CEO role, but also chair, board directors, key functional roles. And we help them assess and develop the leaders that they already have, and we help them to bring in talent from outside the organization. And then we try to help those leaders and teams be successful in working together.
Well, that sounds like a pretty exciting place to be. It's great to see you again and have you do a little visit with us. And thanks, by the way, for the lovely endorsement you gave to Leaders Leap. I really appreciate that. And your being on our podcast.
I am sure that the book will be extremely well received. It's very relevant for today's retail context to go bold and go faster, and I think also just really relevant about leadership and how it's evolving today, and taking personal accountability and reflecting on what might be holding you back. So I would say bravo, and really nice combination of challenge and practical advice.
Thank you. I appreciate that. Well, speaking of that, given the work that you've been doing for quite some time now, maybe you could just share with our audience a little bit about how you've seen this pace of disruption, this accelerating, changing world affect how you think about what you look for in leaders, what you look for in advising clients on adapting to this sort of change.
Yeah, it is such an interesting question. How has the framework for evaluating leaders changed over time? And it really has changed over the last 20, 30 years or so. I remember without aging myself, when I first started working in the search industry, the focus was really on what leaders had done in their career. We were looking backwards, and it was about, making the assumption if somebody's done something at company A, they should be able to pick it up and transfer it to company B. And then the second stage was adding in capabilities. You remember strategic thinking, drive for results, leading change, leading people. And so the focus was about specific competencies. And then we added in character and leadership style, and that giving insights into particular company contexts and how well they'd work with the people around them. But the cherry on the cake, and what has really unlocked a whole new level of insight for us as we think about CEOs, is how people are going to behave in situations that are completely new to them, and how capable they are of reacting and adapting and having that agility to sort of sense when change is required and what to do about it. And this has never been more relevant. So we're in a world where every day for a retail CEO is a tsunami of data and technology developments and AI developments and new different levels of stakeholder expectations and geopolitical challenges, generational change, you name it. So being very open-minded and very humble and very curious and able to synthesize all of these different data points from different sources and then figure out what's the most important thing and continually readjust their thinking in the moment is probably the most critical leadership trait that we're looking for today.
Sure. So maybe related to that, I'd be curious on your take. I remember when we were chatting in Barcelona at the World Retail Congress a year or so ago now, I guess it would be, when I was working on the book, we got into this little conversation about the role of vulnerability. And I think part of the conversation was, I think we probably all grew up in a world where it was much more top down. I, as a leader, have all the answers. But you were speaking a little bit about how that kind of mindset has shifted in the work you do. Could you just talk a little bit more about that? Yeah.
I think it's a very interesting trend in leadership, the rise of the vulnerable leader. And you're absolutely right. In the past, the great leaders were the people who had all the answers, and they showed no weakness at all, and they carried ultimate authority, and they gave orders and people followed them. But I think today that's not practical, and it's not really desirable either. So, from a practical standpoint, the pace of change is just so rapid that leaders don't and can't have all the answers. And so really what they have to do is create the right conditions and the right culture and the right organizing framework for people, the whole organization, to be successful. And it's not desirable to have that style of leadership either, because our society has shifted and there's a whole new generation of employees and stakeholders generally who expect a different type of leadership. And this is a good thing. And I think, when a leader comes and says, I don't know the answer, but this is our general direction of travel, and we're all going to work together to get to the end goal here. And I might not know the answers, but I'm counting on your help, and we're going to figure it out together. That is so much more empowering and exciting, right?
Yeah, no, I think it makes a ton of sense. So before we let you go, would you give any advice? We have, I'm sure, a pretty wide range of folks listening to this, watching this. Any particular advice you'd give to leaders, whether they're maybe earlier in their career or maybe they're trying to ascend to that next level of leadership?
Yeah, I would say that leadership for sure is about the things that you do and the strategy you choose and the results that you deliver and the outcomes for shareholders. And all of that is important. But what people really remember is how leaders make them feel. And I have the privilege of interviewing Judith McKenna at World Retail Congress shortly. And she's had I think she's been on your podcast as well, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah.
But Judith, as you know, is the outgoing president of Walmart International. And during her career, she did all these amazing things and, reshaping the international business and bringing in click and collect, lots of exciting things. But when it was announced that she'd be stepping down, there was this outpouring of affection for her as a leader, all the way from board directors, right the way down to shop floor associates, and not because of her achievements, obviously there are many of them, but it was really the impact that her leadership style had had on them personally and how she'd made them feel. And I think the message I would have is that, if you can lead through change and retain your composure when there's so much going on and you're under such intense scrutiny, but you still continue to treat people with real respect and humanity, then that's really the mark of a great leader.
I love that. And that's probably a great place to end things. Sally, thanks so much. Lovely to see you, and appreciate you coming on to share some of your wisdom with our audience.
Not at all. Thank you. And look forward to seeing you.
All right, that was fantastic. Now, just before we get to our last very special guest, I want to remind everybody, put your questions in the Q&A part. We'll save some time at the end for questions. We've also got a special offer for you coming up at the end. So, Steve, why don't we play our next video with our next guest? It is Hal Lawton, the CEO of Tractor Supply.
Hey, everyone. Sorry that I was able to make the virtual book launch today, but just wanted to say congratulations to Steve on a successful launch. Steve has been a mentor and a counselor to many across retail, including Tractor Supply. And I know this book will just be one more way that he contributes to the retail industry and the continued growth and transformation that we have before us. Congratulations, Steve.
Well, that certainly was very nice. Here.
Well, and he had nice things to say in his blog, and I know he's such a very well-respected leader, regardless of what sector it's in. Sure. So, a question for you: you've been traveling the world, just back from Paris and London. You've probably done a few podcast interviews, I suspect. I saw you had an excerpt in Fast Company. What's been the reaction of the book? Any surprises? Anything that surprised you?
It's always interesting what people will latch onto. So it's been pretty diverse. I would say the two things maybe. One is they really appreciate less the business strategy pieces and more the personal reflections and the challenges, particularly talking about how ego gets in the way, how fear keeps us stuck, those sort of things. Because I think they're not only, what I make up is, not only are those things that affect us as leaders in our jobs, but they're also things that affect us in our lives, with our family, with our personal life. So I think that's that, so a couple of people have said to me, well, a lot of this advice is actually really good for relationships, right? And I said, well, yeah, as it turns out, that wasn't necessarily a sneaky way of wedging that in. But it's been good. The other thing, is, and one of the things I think to be careful about is it's really easy, I think, for myself and for people to kind of glom onto the examples of all the companies that have screwed up and to go, look at these idiots, or how do they get this wrong? And certainly I hear that with Sears. I hear that even a little bit with my former employer Neiman Marcus, which is not in trouble, but has not grown at all really in the last 15 years. And, we can think of any number of companies that are struggling. So it's really easy to have kind of that schadenfreude moment. But what I hope is to provide a lot of hope and inspiration that as much as there are companies that have screwed up, and hopefully like a wake-up call to, don't let your company be one of these companies that sleepwalks through the revolution, that doesn't make the changes they need to, but see the opportunity that comes through change, comes through understanding customers better, taking those leaps, developing a culture of experimentation, whatever it might be. And so one of the, I think we've got a graphic on this, one of the pictures that I show in the book is something that I think is quite inspirational, which is the story of Netflix, which I think most people will realize. And this is a billboard that they had in Hollywood a couple of years ago. And I think it's just a cute reminder But Netflix is a company in its relatively short life that has gone from a DVD model to a streaming model to a third reinvention of getting into production. It is possible, and obviously they're a company that has had normal success by letting go of what was making them successful to leap to the next thing and then leap to another thing. And who knows, maybe we'll see another leap from them in the years ahead.
It's a fantastic example, fun example as well. It's one you can really get your arms around. Now, before we move, as we're kind of heading towards the end of our time together, before we move there, Chapter 10, and this is actually a question from the audience as well. Chapter 10 about taking the big leap. It's such a fundamental, great way to end the book. Speak to that a little bit. We've got a graphic as well, but let's end off on your thoughts on that.
Well, two things I'll mention quickly. One is that for me, this book was a big leap, and part of what I talk about in the final chapter is how I found myself slipping back into my old habits and overthinking things, and not, frankly, being very courageous in my writing. And so this has been really, really helpful for me to work through some of my own stuff. It's not a diary, just to be clear, but or a journal.
That's next. That's next.
But I think you have to follow your own advice from time to time, I think. But I also like the question or like a definition of leap that I didn't come up with, but a great writer named Natalie Nixon came up with, where she tries to define what a leap is. It gets to the essence of what Seth talked about a little bit with his idea of the timid trapeze artist, but having that path that you go for somewhere up off in the distance and having the courage to take those steps, sometimes big, sometimes small, sometimes a series. But hopefully people will learn from the book and be ready to take some of those leaps. So I think in the interest of time and trying to allow for a question or two, I'll stop there.
Let's move on and get to questions from the audience. We do have a couple of questions from the audience. One of them was just about this idea of your chapter 10, the big leap. Another question is, how do you identify the time or the right timing for a disruptive leap? Is there such a thing?
Well, again, it's a little hard to give a too generic an answer here, but I think that and this is really what the Mind Leaps 1 and 2 are about, crush your ego and wake up. If you are opening the aperture, if you're doing the work, you're exploring the perimeters of your ignorance. What are those things that are going on that might make a difference? What are the things that you're doing that may not serve you well? What are the trends in technology and consumers? If you're really, really developing that very keen awareness and discernment, and I think most importantly, really accepting the reality of the implications, you will get a sense of when it's time to take a leap. Now, one of the things I'm very careful to say is leaps are not about a moonshot or a Hail Mary. Mm-hmm. Like you're trying to avoid, like the worst case situation is to be to that point of extinction, and then you're just trying crazy stuff at the end. You need to be staying on top of this. And one of the ways you manage or understand how to take a leap and when to make the right time to take that leap is by testing and learning and exploring. So again, I can't give like one answer for everybody's situation, but I think if you're digging deep, if you're honest with yourself, if you're breaking through denial, if you're realizing the risk of not moving forward, then I think you'll have a good sense of where to go next.
This question from the audience, and you kind of hinted at this. I guess when you put Netflix up, and you've said this is not really a retail focused book. These lessons, I think and you would say that they're as applicable to any industry. Is there any other industry that you mention in the book that you want to call out that these kind of principles hold true with?
I sometimes say, like, if you're in the dry cleaning business or something, the speed of disruption is probably pretty slow. But I would say, generally speaking, most industries are being affected, particularly by digital disruption, digital technology, the implications of generative AI and other technologies, cloud computing, et cetera, have been rippling through most industries for a while.
Sure.
And then,
of course,
cab
industry, right? Even the cabs versus Uber.
Right. So
many examples.
It's hard not to see a major industry that, healthcare, financial services, you go through the list of companies that have seen both iconic brands fall or struggle, and insurgent competition disrupt the playing field in some way, shape, or form. So I didn't make an attempt to go through every SIC code and kind of grade them, but the media world in particular, you just think about going from a world of first three big TV networks, at least in the U.S., to newspapers, radios, et cetera, to almost everything being available digitally. And the companies that are winning today are not at all the companies that were successful 10, 15, 20 years ago.
A quick question about who should be reading the book. We talked about it off the top. Is it your intention that it would also be a great handbook or book to have below the CEO level, like folks who are leading business units? Do you think they could make use of these 7 principles as well?
Absolutely. I think, given that things sort of operate at, or this book operates at both the kind of business design level, where do you need, if you're in the department store industry or the hotel industry or whatever it might be, where might you need to really, you need to blow up your current business model essentially over time and move to something different. That's going to be much more the province of boards, CEO and the CEO's direct reports. But when it comes to product innovation, service line innovation, project innovation, many of the principles will apply as well. So why to your earlier question, I did write it with kind of the C-suite in mind, or investors or boards. I do think there's plenty of benefits to people that might be at the VP, director, senior manager level.
Bit of a quick philosophical question. Disruption and innovation both in parallel, or innovation will be into the disruption?
Well, I tried to avoid, there's a lot of semantics that get thrown around. So, to me, disruption is where you're really fundamentally changing the basis of competition. So, you can innovate. I guess at one level, pumpkin spice latte was an innovation, right? But it didn't disrupt the beverage category. So to me, there are degrees of innovation which, if they become profound enough, may lead to disruption. So they're all important. And I think, again, one of the things is, I'm not suggesting every business needs to blow itself up, or every business needs to be taking these huge leaps from out of nowhere, kind of. You need to be doing optimization. You need to be doing probably a portfolio of innovations, some big, some small, as well as thinking about the degree to which you might need to fundamentally rethink your business model. So, your mileage may vary, I guess.
A couple more quick questions. This one's pretty interesting. I'm not sure you answer this. You might answer this in the book, but basically, do you think companies kind of say the opportunity cost of not transitioning versus the risk of change? Is there a spreadsheet in here somewhere where they're making that kind of calculation, or is it just floating around in the ether and just unsaid?
Well, I don't think it's necessarily super deliberate, but one of the things about this book, if people have read Clayton Christensen's The Innovator's Dilemma, which is from the 90s, one of the things he points out that makes companies vulnerable to disruption is that in many companies, what makes you successful is optimization. It's not doing the creative thing. And so the tendency tends to be to just kind of turn the dials, because that's the thing that gets you your annual bonus. That's the thing that keeps the quarterly earnings going. That's the thing that might get you promotion. So being good at management is actually the thing in many cases that makes you most vulnerable. So some of those principles, as people who will read in the beginning of Clayton Christensen's book, I think are still very much in play. What's different today is the pace of change, the digital piece in particular, and social media and the way we're all connected is really, really different than when Christensen's work started to take hold. So I think that, there's a self-reinforcing principle of cultures. One of the things I say in the book is many cultures are wired to say no to everything, to defend the status quo. One of my favorite quotes in the book is from a venture capitalist who said, how was it that God was able to create the world in 7 days? Well, he didn't have to worry about the installed base. And, there's just a lot of protecting the status quo that is just embedded in the way so many organizations are run. So that is tough to overcome. I don't think it's a conscious decision. I think where conscious decisions come in, and it's a vexing issue, is if you're a publicly traded company, if your reputation is for slow and steady, to come out and suddenly announce a really bold agenda it is a very difficult thing to do as a practical matter, because Wall Street may not support you, or your board may not support you, or they might say, well, thanks, we'll get thanks for playing, but here's a copy of the home game, and we'll get somebody else in here that just kind of keeps the status quo in place.
Well, Tim Hortons up here in Canada just announced the launch of pizza, and it's making all the news, and it's quite controversial. I mean, oh my God.
Should be pumpkin spice pizza.
Last question, and it's a good one, and I think it dovetails into something Seth said. Don't buy one book, buy 5 to kind of spread the idea around. And
I think he said 10, just to be clear.
Just to be okay. He buy 10, buy more. And the question is really, okay, any advice on how to wake up your CEO or your president if they don't see this train coming? I mean, the obvious answer, buy those 10 books. Maybe they suggest the answer, leave it by the newspaper in the morning. But any advice on that? You've been through lots of whether consulting or whether working for them, lots of, how do you get that? How do you get the leadership to that place?
Well, my hope is that this will be a book. I don't know if this exactly answers the question, but my hope is that this will be a book that teams read together, not, sitting around a table out loud. I don't mean that, but, this will be the kind of book that inspires a conversation about whether the organization is really taking the risks that they should, making the changes that will not only keep them allow them to survive, but actually thrive and win the future. So part of the idea of whether it's 10 copies or 12 copies or 5 copies is that this is inspiration for some really tough conversations. And I think, as I mentioned earlier, the 7 Mind Leap chapters each have these questions. And they're the kind of thing where I would say, give the book to the CEO or a colleague or your teammates, then say, let's schedule some time a couple weeks out and let's talk about these questions, because they should frame up the issues. And if you're ready to have a tough dialogue in some cases, because there's some provocative pieces here where, not to, even though I do sort of quote her in the book, but it's just Taylor Swift's world and we're all living in it. So Merry Swiftness to all who celebrate is, I'm the problem, it's me. And on a lot of chances, that is a discussion that having, being vulnerable and discussing about how as a leader we may get in our own way. I mean, it's definitely my case. I talk a little bit about some of my challenges over the years in how my ego was the enemy. So I hope it will forge great conversation. Certainly if people want to chat with me about that some more, I'd be happy to do that.
Well, that's a great way to leave our day today. Let's leave it and wrap there. Bridget, thanks again so much for joining us, and thanks to all the guests that we've had. We've run a few minutes late, but lots of questions to answer. And as Steve said, don't forget about contacting him at any time. So with that being said, let's leave it there. And thank you all very much. Thank you, Steve. Congratulations on launching the book. Great.
Thank you. Thanks, everybody. Thanks everybody for joining, and to our guests, and thanks Michael for being the hostess or host with the most, whatever.
Host with the most. Hey, it was my pleasure. Congrats on the book, and everyone get ready to leap. Thanks for tuning in. New episodes of Season 8 presented by Salonis will show up every Tuesday, so be sure to tell your friends and colleagues in the retail industry all about us.
I'm Steve Dennis, author of the best-selling book Remarkable Retail, and my new forthcoming book, Leaders Leap, Transforming Your Company at the Speed of Disruption. You can learn more about me, my consulting, and keynote speaking at stephenpdennis.com.
I'm Michael LeBlanc, consumer retail growth consultant, keynote speaker, and a host of a series of retail trade podcasts, including this one. You can learn more about me on LinkedIn. Steve's new book, Leaders Leap, is available today from your favorite bookseller in the United States and releasing a bit later in some global markets. Safe travels, everyone.